Hello, everyone. This is the Free American Press with your host, Alexander Horat. Before we begin, if you could please subscribe to the channel and leave a like, that would be great. Today, we're having James Corbett back on the show. James Corbett is an award-winning independent writer and documentary producer. Since 2007, his website, corbettreport.com, has presented thousands of videos, articles, and interviews, garnering an enormous and influential following and earning James a reputation for integrity and insight. Hello, James. Thank you for coming back on the show.
No problem, Alexander. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and today we're going to be discussing James Corbett's book, Reportage, and we're going to be asking him a question for each chapter. It's a very interesting book, and I definitely say that you should definitely go and buy it. Going on the first chapter, Adventures in the New Media, how do you believe new media platforms have transferred the nature and truth-telling and power in the digital age, and what are unintended consequences of this shift?
I've talked about this a number of times over the years on my podcast, and I've called it the Gutenberg Revolution 2.0 because as transformative as the Gutenberg printing press was to the development of civilization itself as we know it, I'd say we're going through a similar process right now. And there's a lot of instructive parallels and a lot of warnings that we should take from that. Because, of course, people who know about the history of the printing press will know that obviously there were a lot of kings and tyrants who did not like the type of free flow of information that the printing press provided. So they tried to put their thumb on that by censoring the press in various ways. You saw the Licensing Act in Britain and other such things. Well, I think we are going through a similar process right now where the tyrants and authoritarians of our day and age really liked that 20th century model of the establishment mainstream media, which, as we know, a handful of corporations by the end of the 20th century were controlling what 99% of people were reading and seeing and hearing on a daily basis. That's very good if you have a few connected crony individuals sitting on the boards of those media conglomerates who are tied into the financial, economic, political oligarchy, and they can essentially control the narrative for society. That has been utterly upended over the past couple of decades. And I think there's probably no better example than my own story, if only because who on earth am I? I'm a nobody. I'm a guy who got his master's in Anglo-Irish literature. I was teaching English in Japan. I started a podcast on a beat up old laptop with a $20 microphone and fast forward 20 years. And here I am talking to tens of thousands of people on a regular basis. I've reached millions of people overall. It's insane. It's crazy to think that that happened. But it happened because we are living in this age of decentralized distributed media. And so I think it truly is a revolutionary moment, but definitely we see the reaction to that coming in the form of censorship.
Yeah, I definitely agree. They have been censoring and doing some things, but I think it's definitely been a good thing because we wouldn't be able to hear from people like you if the media was just all on television and controlled by a few media companies. So I think what you've been saying has been really receptive to people. What you've been telling is the truth. So I think that's why people flock to see what you're doing. And I think it's really great what you're doing. Going to the next chapter, the 9/11 terror trade. In this chapter, you examine the financial and structural flows surrounding 9/11. What evidence most surprised you, and why does it still matter for understanding our modern geopolitics?
I guess the one thing that people should know about this, the terror trade, so the idea that there was informed trading before the events of 9/11 that showed that there were people who knew about it. I mean, one of the surprising things I would imagine for most people is that there has not been one peer-reviewed study that has demonstrated conclusively that yes, all of the evidence lines up with the idea of informed trading. There have not been two such studies. There have been three peer-reviewed studies that have independently concluded that exact same thing. So this is not out there strange conspiracy ponderings or speculation. Um, but beyond that, I mean, people might remember some of that early reporting, some of which I cite in the book. Antonio Mora of ABC News and others talking about hey, there were people placing bets against some of the corporations that were hit on 9/11, and the FBI, the SEC has started an investigation. But not a lot of people know that the SEC concluded their investigation, decided that, well, yeah, there were some links to institutional investors who seemed to be trading with advanced knowledge, but they had no ties to Al Qaeda and thus could not have been to blame. And then they destroyed those records of the, at the time, the largest SEC investigation in history as part of routine record keeping. Nothing to see there. So I think even just that amount of information should be enough to wake people up to the fact that there is a much bigger story here. But when they finally discover that, oh, it turns out that there's this guy named Wirt Walker who's a distant cousin of the Bushes and had worked with one of the Bush brothers in a company that was providing security for one of the World Trade Center and others. He was involved in this company that turns out the FBI were at least interested in him and his trades in some of these companies beforehand. Shouldn't people be interested in that particular factoid? I would say so.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. So what exactly happened to Building 7?
Well, it didn't commit suicide, is what I would say. And yes, hopefully, I would assume that if anything of 9/11 truth has penetrated to the public consciousness by now, it is Building 7. But for those who don't know, 47-story office tower would have dwarfed any large structure in almost any city in the world. The only reason it didn't in New York is because it was right next to the World Trade Center 1 and 2. But a 47-story steel-framed office tower that was not hit by an airplane came down completely symmetrically into its own footprint at gravitational freefall acceleration at 5:20 p.m. on the day of 9/11. Not a lot of people knew about it for many years because it was reported and then basically forgotten. It wasn't even mentioned in the 9/11 Commission report. But since that time, there's been a lot of questions about exactly how did it fall. And NIST itself came up with, I believe it was 5 ultimate ideas, theories of the reason for the precipitation of that collapse that were all then discarded. And eventually they settled on this fantasy about thermal expansion at a certain joint that caused this complete symmetrical collapse of the entire building, which really would go against all known fire codes and everything. We've just seen, as we're recording this, there was that office skyscraper fire in Hong Kong where there were multiple buildings that burned for, I believe, over 20 hours, something like that. They didn't fall into their own footprint. I wonder why. Again, we've never seen anything quite like what happened on 9/11 at any other time in history. So I think it's safe to say that that was a controlled demolition or an explosive event of some sort.
Yeah, I remember Donald Trump even saying that it was looked like a controlled demolition, but then he changed his mind and oh, those airplanes caused a lot of fire or whatever. So he even admitted that. So I think what you say is true. I think Building 7 is definitely important to look at in 9/11. So let's get to the next chapter, up and down politics. You argue that the left-right paradigm in many ways is outdated. How would you redefine or replace that paradigm to better reflect contemporary power structures?
So the idea here is that the idea of politics that we are presented is that it is a spectrum from left to right, and there are various gradations along the way of far left and moderate left and center and moderate right and far right. But that's the totality of our thinking, a one-dimensional straight line. And what I intend to propose with this essay is essentially to broaden our thinking from one dimension to, can you imagine it, 2 dimensions? And when we do so, we find that there is an up-down axis when it comes to politics. And that up down axis, as the way I define it, is authoritarianism versus anti authoritarianism. And I think most people at base, the most average people, and I'm sure the vast majority of people on the planet are anti-authoritarian by nature. They do not want these cloying, centralized power structures with boots on the face that are clearly run by oligarchs for the benefit of oligarchs, benefiting Wall Street at the expense of Main Street, et cetera, et cetera. People generally do not want that, but they have no power to truly articulate that in a way outside of that left-right paradigm. And so they vote for people on the left who promise them what they want, or they vote for people on the right who promise them what they want, and yet they continue to move in the same direction, and things continue progressing towards this greater and greater centralization of power and control in fewer and fewer hands. Why is this? It's because of that neglected up-down axis. And yes, you can vote for the puppet on the left or the puppet on the right, but if they're both pointing in that upward direction towards authoritarianism, then you're going to ultimately end up in a remarkably similar place, we'll say. And I could point to many examples of that in American presidential politics and people who were voting for the hope and change of Obama, for example, or people voting for drain the swamp with Trump, etc., and finding that they do not get what they voted for and wondering why. Well, up-down politics is one way of explaining why they don't get what they want.
Yeah, I definitely agree. It's always been kind of mind-boggling for me as they say there's far right and far left, and we can look at examples like Hitler. He killed millions of people, and he had a very power-structured government. And Stalin, who's supposedly far left, killed millions of people too. So aren't these the far right and far left basically the same? Is that just to keep us in like a rat race, thinking that one's better than the other?
Well, yeah, I guess that's one way of framing it. And of course, that's the horseshoe theory that people have talked about. The very far left and the very far right end up being the same thing. Why is that? And I think the up-down analogy is one way of explaining that in a way that makes sense. And I start the essay with a parable, an analogy, essentially, of ants walking on a loop of string. But the problem is the ants do not know that the loop actually curves around. So they're essentially walking around in a circle. They think they're walking in a straight line because from the ant's perspective, all they see is this line and they're moving forward. But then suddenly they're facing people that they were moving away from. How did that happen? It's because they went around the loop of string. And so if we can understand there's a second dimension to politics, then we can understand how that happens. The left and the right loop around onto each other. If you're moving in the same authoritarian direction, you're going to meet at a certain point.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that was a really good analogy of the ants in your book. So, they don't want your genes in the pool. That was the next chapter. How does the manipulation of biotechnology and genetic policy tie into broader systems of control, and where do you see the greatest vulnerabilities for society?
Well, this is about the extremely important but extremely neglected field of history known as eugenics. And eugenics was a craze, a true craze that swept over at least Western countries in the late 19th slash early 20th century. It developed in England in the late 19th century. Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, was the one who coined the term and really started the field as a respectable field of research of science at that time. And the idea is that of course, we know that there's some degree of heritability of various traits. And the eugenicists took that to the extent of, well, of obviously, the ability of people, for example, the moral character of people is also somehow inherited through, and they didn't even have the terminology of genetics or any sort of understanding of genetics at that level. So they talked about protoplasm and these other pseudoscientific concepts. There's some sort of protoplasm that makes certain people essentially destined to be criminals and destitutes and prostitutes and whatever else. And then there's the good protoplasm, which makes people into nice gentlemen scientists like Francis Galton and Charles Darwin. And so it was obviously at base a completely self-serving pseudoscientific nonsense that was propounded for decades. But of course, since it appealed to and stroked the ego of powerful, rich and powerful people, because it told them that clearly you have this good stock, you're from the good protoplasm, and you deserve to have a big, happy, prosperous family. Eugenics, as in well-born, as in we should foster these families of these people who are rich and powerful and wealthy because they have good stock. That's why they are rich and powerful and wealthy. Of course, the dark side of eugenics, which doesn't get discussed, is dysgenics. The idea, well, okay, yes, you want to foster those families of the good stock. What do you do about the bad stock, the criminals and the destitute, etc.? Well, you kind of got to weed them out of the gene pool. And that has been an important part of understanding the last century plus of elite politics or elitist politics, essentially trying to foster populations of, billionaires, but trying to weed out the lower classes. And when you start thinking of population control in those terms, not just in terms of limiting the number of people on the planet, but also getting rid of certain types of people on the planet, there's a much darker agenda at play than I think most people realize. Then when, as you say, we start thinking about that in the modern context of literal gene editing and other such technologies that are now available, you start thinking about how deep and dark this agenda could go. And we could literally have gene edited humans walking around in the future. And it has been talked about many times in the past. But this technology would, of course, be available to those who have the means and resources to use such technologies. thus further enhancing their offspring who already have the benefit of the inherited generational wealth and private education and all of these other perks and benefits that are available to the very wealthy, that will again further drive the wedge between the elitist upper class and the sort of working class down below. And that is really the nightmare scenario that we're stepping into. And partly, at the very least, it's because we do not know this history of eugenics and dysgenics and the people who genuinely believe that they are superior and deserve to rule over other human beings because of their superior stock.
So they're definitely still practicing eugenics in the world.
I think that is self-evident when you start to understand this history. You start to see the way that this is applied everywhere. And one example that I'll point to, I did for example, a documentary back in 2020 on Bill Gates, Who is Bill Gates, in which I framed some of his bizarre and strange predilections, like for population control and limiting population and implantable birth control chips that could be operated remotely, et cetera, in terms of Bill Gates's seeming affinity for the eugenics idea.
Wow, that's pretty important to know. So, going on to the Petch story, the software firm Petch is used as a case study. What does its story reveal about the relationship between private tech intelligence agencies and the state?
Very good question. So most people have never heard of PTech Inc., but they should look into it. It was a software firm that was established in Massachusetts in the 1990s, I believe, is when it was established. But it came to attention through a 9/11 whistleblower named Indira Singh, who was running risk management consulting for JP Morgan. And at the time, obviously, one of the largest banks on the planet, risk management was a very, very important thing. So she was doing due diligence on software companies that were providing enterprise architecture software, which was essentially, I guess, what would be some early version of AI. Essentially, this was you give these computers programmers, the software engineers, access to everything, the back end and the whole computer infrastructure of your organization, and it will create this God's eye view of your whole organization and map out all the relationships. And we'll be able to, for example, proactively monitor for any suspicious activity, like suspicious trades that are happening, etc., and be able to stop it even before it happens. And she was researching this company and found, there's some very strange ties here. Like it turns out that the angel investor who was investing in this turns out to be an associate of Dick Cheney as well as Osama bin Laden, and there's all these strange ties into the Al Qaeda, Al Qaeda netherworld, et cetera, et cetera. She tried to pursue some of these leads and was literally told by the FBI agents that she was trying to bring this to the attention of. They said, you're in a better position to investigate this stuff than we are. I go through the one particular FBI agent who was running an Operation Green Quest, trying to track down some of this terrorist money laundering, etc., that was going on in the United States. And his superiors raged at him. You will not open an investigation into this guy. We're shutting down Operation Green Quest. He essentially got run out of his position, etc., because he was daring to try to bring attention to this. And it does raise that fundamental question. All right, so what was this company? Where did it come from? Why did it have all these high-level contacts and contracts with some of the most important and sensitive agencies in the US? And perhaps most intriguingly, what was it doing on 9/11 when it was working on the systems of interoperability between the FAA and NORAD, the kind of crisis management systems that were the exact systems that were also being used for example, simulating the radar blips on the screens of the NORAD war game planners, because oh yeah, they were running numerous war games on the day of 9/11, injecting fake hijackings and others onto radar screens of NORAD operators. And so there has been speculation that PTech software was involved and that Dick Cheney was personally running PTech down in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. Now, there is obviously some degree of speculation on that, but there are some very fascinating questions. And it does, as you say, raise those questions about the connection between intelligence agencies, governments, and these private software firms.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I definitely think there's some connection there. So going on to selling your soul for a matrix stake, you use a vivid metaphor here. How do symbolic comforts like matrix stakes enable deeper forms of servitude, and what might breaking that cycle look like?
I guess, Yeah, so for people who don't know, the analogy here is to the Matrix movies, and if people have seen that, they might remember that there's a scene where one of the people in this Matrix, this computer simulated fantasy world, is selling out people in the real world for the promise of having whatever he wants within this computer generated fantasy world. So he's eating at this fine restaurant with this delicious piece of steak, and he says, I know this isn't real, but my brain is telling me it's real, and it's fantastic. So the idea is people can be led along by things that aren't even real, and maybe they even know it isn't real, but hey, it has the effect of feeling good, so I'm going to do it anyway. And when we put that in a monetary context, we have to start interrogating that simplest question that children ask, and which will generally be dismissed as a joke: where does money come from? Well, it grows on trees. Ha ha ha. Well, no, no, no. Actually, truly, where does money? What is money exactly? How is it created? How is it brought into the economy, et cetera, et cetera? If we really start interrogating that, then we will see a bigger history. And so I talk about some of that history of the development of the monetary paradigm as we know it, going from tangible goods with actual measurable utility slash wealth in terms of precious metals or whatever, and how that got turned into these paper certificates that will, okay, so this paper certificate entitles you to some of this gold in the vault. We'll keep the gold safe for you in the vault. We'll just give you these certificates. And eventually, more and more of these certificates get circulated, and who knows how much gold is actually in the vault, but we've got all these paper, and people start trading the paper as if it is the gold. And once you start doing that and starting substituting the fake for the real, and then people start trading the fake, and then you can put more and more and more of that fake into existence. And then eventually, as we get to the 21st century, there isn't even the pretense that it's based on gold anymore. Nixon shut the gold window back in 1971. There's no actual tie down to any physical reality now with the US dollar, for example. So what is this all based on? Well, it's all based on the good faith and credit of the government or something like that. But whatever this is, it's literally, I mean, if you're talking about physical currency, it's literally just printed inks on cotton paper. I mean, it's not, why do we value this? Because everyone values it, and we know we can exchange it for goods and services. So good enough. I know it's not real, but it tastes great, so I don't care. And the point is that if there is a level of manipulation in which you can get people to live, strive, work for, die for, kill for these colored pieces of cotton paper, then you can get people to compromise their morals or to completely upend their lives in pursuit of something that doesn't even actually have meaning. And at the very least, okay, whatever, that's all pie in the sky, because at the very least you can trade these pieces of paper or more and more of these electronic digits for things of real value. So what does it matter? Well, it still does matter, because at the end of the day, again, what is it that we are striving for? Are we living just to earn more and more of these digits in our bank account, or are we living for community with our fellow human beings and to raise families and to flourish on this planet? How are we directing our energies?
I definitely agree. There seems to be a lot of people who seem to worship money as a god, and I think they're going to be getting rid of that physical paper and, like you said, get digital digits on the screen, and that's the next step for them. First, you get rid of the gold standard, then you get rid of the paper physical standard, and then you just are left with the digital standard, and then they can change their digits on the screen whenever they want to. So that's definitely a big problem, and I'm glad you brought that up. So, on your chapter, How to Really Defeat Globalism, many critique globalism but offer few alternatives. What are the key practical steps you propose for moving beyond globalism in a meaningful way?
The absolute most important thing that people need to do is to essentially tear down what Larkin Rose, for example, is called the most dangerous superstition, which is the idea that governments themselves have authority, have legitimate authority over people who have not voted and don't participate in their process. But that people believe in the legitimate authority of government is essentially the most dangerous superstition. And why that is the real answer to globalism is because if you asked most people, okay, are you concerned about this global government, United Nations, World Economic Forum, these types of organizations and institutions? If those people say yes, and you say, well, then what is the solution to that? Most people will say, well, we need stronger national government, obviously. The national government will protect us from the global government. And that's exactly what we see, for example, with the MAGA idea. And what I think most people are supporting that for. It's America first, we support the United States, and so we reject the World Health Organization, we reject the UN, we reject things like that. And while you might argue, I suppose, that is a step in the right direction, as in down closer towards the individual, I would say no, that fundamentally isn't the it's again a step in the right direction, but it won't fundamentally upend the system. Because if you get people to worship a flag, for example, the United States flag or whatever it is, then you just swap out the flag. Now it's the UN flag. And it's the same system, it's just on a different scale. Whereas we have to envision a completely different system if we want to truly defeat the globalist mindset. The globalist mindset is the mindset that we should give our identity over to this broad collective. There's some sort of nefarious, whatever it is, some sort of mysterious social contract that essentially abrogates our individual sovereignty as individual sovereign human beings that we have to subsume in this collective. And that's the exact same thing people are doing with nationalism. So until we defeat that and realize, no, it is my individual sovereign right as a sovereign human being to exist on this planet and to choose to cooperate in this scheme or to participate in that, or maybe I'll choose to vote in this selection process, and yes, whoever wins, I'll follow their orders or whatever the case may be. Sure, as long as it is a voluntary, conscious choice. So really, to me, it isn't that complicated. What we have to do is defeat the gatekeeper in our mind that tells us that we are beholden to these broad collectives, political collectives, and that we have to subsume our individual sovereignty in the collective.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we need to bring back individualism, and that's what America was founded on, not have like Nazism or communism where the individual means nothing. So I definitely agree with you there in your analysis on that. So going to the biotech billionaires and GMO doomsday chapter, in your view, how are the interests of wealthy entrepreneurs misaligned with those of the public, and what regulatory or cultural reforms would you recommend?
Yes, this is an increasingly important question because, as I talk about in the essay, obviously the gene editing and genetic manipulation technologies are becoming more advanced and are becoming more and more a part of our food supply, if nothing else. And I talk about the various ways that crops, for example, are being engineered genetically. For example, most famously and perhaps most successfully over the past few decades, the GM, once Monsanto, now Bayer crops that have been genetically modified to resist the Roundup herbicide, which has now become the most applied chemical agricultural product in the history of the planet over the past few decades, because there are now so many of these GM engineered crops that have been genetically engineered to resist the herbicide. But then we find out about all of the problems with Roundup, and I do talk about those health problems that have arisen because of this application of this chemical monstrosity, essentially. And that's just one example of the way that the food supply itself is being genetically engineered. And now we're starting to talk about the genetic engineering of cattle and livestock and other such things for human consumption. So it is becoming more and more of a concern. And that's not even talking about the fake synthetic lab created meats and other such things, those types of monstrosities that are now coming into view. Having said that, I think that this is a problem. I think we have this incredible abundant earth where you plant seeds in the ground and suddenly you get trees that flower and have, over the course of generations can feed entire populations. It's an incredible system of wonderful nature that unfortunately is being centralized, monopolized into a handful of seed cartels and biotech companies. And I think we do that at our own peril. Um, and it becomes more and more dramatic when you start to think that the genetic engineering doesn't just affect these particular crops in this particular time. Well, obviously, they start to populate and spread out into nature and start to subsume nature potentially. And we've seen, for example, Percy Schmeiser in Canada became famous because he wasn't growing Monsanto crops, but some of the Monsanto crops from neighbors' fields blew into his field, and Monsanto discovered those crops on his property and thus were trying to sue him for breaching their intellectual property rights. All of these kinds of crazy things. And now imagine that on the grand scale as these genetic engineering experiments essentially populate out into the genome. It does really raise the specter of the complete changeover of the ecosystem generally, of the global ecosystem. And In that context, I talk about the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, this this frozen repository of genetic information that's carved out into the Arctic tundra in some remote Arctic archipelago, in which they are literally storing seeds for the eventuality of what exactly? I guess the contamination of the entire Earth's genome, essentially. So anyway, the stakes are high. The question, as you put it, is what do we do about that? What kind of regulatory or behavioral changes need to happen? Well, I do not, as you might have guessed by now, do not put a lot of faith in the regulatory process to handle this. And I think that it's quite demonstrable that the economic oligarchical interests are the ones that are really calling the shots with regards to these regulations anyway, not the politicians. So if we really want to confront this crisis, I think the buck stops at our dinner plate. We, at the very least, at the moment, can control what we eat and what we do not eat. And I think it is incumbent on us to make better informed decisions about what we're putting in our mouths so that we don't at least contribute to this problem.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's definitely important to buy organic, non-GMO stuff. It's definitely better for you because we don't know in the next 100 years how eating this Monsanto corn and these genetically engineered crops are going to be affecting the human race, physically and mentally. So it's definitely important, like you say, to choose what you eat in a very important aspect. So on your chapter, How to Enjoy Your Servitude, this chapter suggests that the power often desires consent rather than cohesion. What psychological and cultural dynamics support this phenomenon?
I'm sorry, can you ask that question one more time?
Yes. So it's on your chapter, How to Enjoy Your Servitude. This
Oh.
chapter suggests that power often desires consent rather than cohesion. What psychological and cultural dynamics support this phenomenon?
So the chapter deals with a hopefully humorous hypothetical scenario of a time traveler who has arrived from the 1950s, suddenly transported into 2020s, and is trying to come to grips with all of these drastic changes that have occurred in society over the past 70 years. And from social media and all of these phenomenon to all of the things that people, certainly Americans in the 1950s would have been imbued with a certain sense of their inalienable rights in the Constitution and we're fighting the communists, etc. But if you were suddenly transported into the 2020s, you'd be surprised by how much of what you were fighting against 70 years ago is now part of American culture. And how did that happen? And the question is, how does that happen? How can entire societies and civilizations be led along by the nose, essentially? And so I look at a number of ways that that could happen, but one of them, of course, suggested by T.H. Huxley, who was obviously the author of Brave New World. Sorry, Aldous Huxley, not T.H. Huxley. T.H. Huxley is Darwin's bulldog. I'm getting my Huxleys confused. That was his grandfather. Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World and talked about the way that that various methods can be used for essentially steering people into their servitude and to make them not only put up with servitude, but to actively enjoy it. And he gave a number of speeches, interviews around the time shortly before his passing in 1963. So in 1961, I believe, he delivered a speech on the ultimate revolution, talking about the types of technologies that were now available to precisely make people love their own servitude, enjoy their own servitude. And he talked about the experiments that he had personally seen of mice who had had their brains hooked up to electrodes that would deliver shocks in such a way that it would provide them pleasure. And he talked about this, how some of these mice would literally just shock themselves to death, literally, because they enjoyed the pleasure so much. And if you can enjoy, if you can be made psychopharmacologically or neurologically or through other methods, technological methods, to enjoy your surroundings and whatever you're living through, then as Huxley warned, I think he was actually salivating a bit as he said this, but he did warn that scientific dictatorships of the future the authoritarians would enjoy the type of control over the population that tyrants of the past would have dreamed of. And I think that is very much a danger that we're stepping into. And again, part of that is that we don't often stop to reflect how quickly and how drastically change has occurred over such a short time period so that you can get someone going from, that 1950s mindset to the 2020s mindset. And if we were to stop and reflect on that, I think perhaps we would have a chance of breaking through the conditioning that has been imposed on us.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. So the three types chapter, you would identify three archetypes of power or governance. Can you briefly define each and explain which one you believe will dominate the next decade?
You know what? I will refrain from doing that because I think the three types essay is actually just a little bit of a almost Zen-like meditation that needs to be experienced. And I think people need to answer that for themselves. As I put in that essay, I hope very simply there are three types of people. Which one are you? So I'll leave people to come to their own conclusion on that one.
Yep, that sounds great. So let's move on to the next question. So the strange life of Marcy Strong, that's the chapter. Marcy Strong is a fascinating figure. What aspect of his career most encapsulates the hidden workings of the elite networks and global governance?
Yeah. Fascinating story. So, for people who don't know, Morris Strong was literally a junior high school dropout who had this remarkable, charmed life and I can't even begin to do justice. I think people have to read the paragraph just going through some of his accomplishments, titles, the various boards of various directors that he had been on, the institutions that he had founded or that he had served as a director, et cetera, et cetera. It's a remarkable list. And the question is, how did this junior high school dropout from Manitoba in Canada, the middle of nowhere, how did he rise to such prominence? And I think at least part of that answer is that, well, he ended up meeting David Rockefeller at the right time. He was taken under the Rockefeller wing, and essentially he was a made man from that point forward, first making his millions in the oil patch in Alberta and then expanding out from there, eventually becoming the head of Petro-Canada at the same time as he became the leading voice for environmentalism at the global stage, founding the United Nations Environment Programs, doing the Rio Earth Summit, all of these types of things. How do you square that circle? How does the leading environmentalist of his age also happen to be a millionaire from the oil patch? And what does that mean? Oh, well, he was involved with the Rockefeller family, which was, of course, the oil family, which became synonymous with environmental causes in its philanthropic phase. And I think there's an instructive story behind that. But essentially, for people who don't know about the story of Morris Strong, it is a wild story. But I think it does show us how power really operates and how cliques form in which certain people can rise to positions of unimaginable prominence just by having the right connections, knowing the right people, and saying the right things.
Yeah, I think connections are definitely very important. So that's definitely important to know. So, on the real meaning of independence, how has the concept of national independence been co-opted or misused in the modern era? And what should true independence look like in a globalized world?
Yes, well, again, perhaps going back to that globalism, how to really defeat globalism essay, I think, again, a lot of people tend to think of independence as at the very best, and maybe it is the very best example that we have in the modern world, but the Declaration of Independence, one of the few political documents that I can mostly get behind. I agree with a lot of it and the sentiment behind it, but even so, people who think that their inalienable rights are going to come a Bill of Rights or a constitution or some signed piece of paper that they actually didn't sign themselves are probably deluding themselves. And I think we should really think about what that concept is, independence. What is independence and where does it come from? If there are inalienable rights that inhere in us by virtue of being human beings, then clearly those are not bestowed on us by government because any right that can be given to us by a government can be taken away by a government. No, these are fundamental parts of our being, and we have to know and live and think that. And once we manifest that in the real world, that is our independence. And who knows? Jackbooted thugs of various stripes serving the orders of various tyrants may come and go and may put people in cages, etc. But they cannot lock up your mind, your heart, your spirit. As long as the human spirit still exists, we will still have independence.
Yeah, I definitely think the human spirit's so important, and I think it's really important for people to stick fast to their values even when things are going against them. Because without your values and your human experience, you're basically nothing, I really think. So I think that's definitely important. So going on to the 9/11 whistleblowers chapter, whistleblowers are often marginalized. What structural protections or cultural shifts are necessary to elevate their voices and truths they reveal?
First and foremost, we just need to listen to them because, as I remark at the beginning of this essay, people will often say, oh, a big conspiracy like 9/11 could never happen because someone would have talked. Well, actually, a lot of people have talked. Here's some of them. And I go through the story of people like Kevin Ryan or J. Michael Springman or Richard Grove, etc. And these are stories that are out there. They're documented. We don't have to speculate about it. We can talk to those people themselves. But for some reason, for whatever reason, the establishment media doesn't talk to people like this. Why is that? So I think really what needs to happen is people need to listen to voices like this, and people in a position to bring these voices to other people's attention should do so. So that's what I'm attempting to do with this essay.
Yeah, that's definitely great. So, on why we must oppose Bilderberg, you argue for opposing the Bilderberg group. What concrete mechanisms of influence does this group exert, and how can citizens counteract them?
Well, the standard reply that a Bilderberger would give is that this is just a talking shop, essentially. We just go there, we discuss world issues that are of importance. There's no consensus. We don't come out with a statement at the end of this. There's no policy decisions that are made there. But that is of essentially directly undermined by some of the attendees themselves and what they've said over the years. For example, I talk about the former head of the EU who talked about how the euro currency was developed at Bilderberg, for example, or we talk about the European Union itself and how it was essentially forwarded from the very inception of the Bilderberg Group. Or you talk about, I cite one of the NATO representatives at Bilderberg one year who talked about how he said in an interview, we go back to our respective countries and implement what we talked about. So they've talked about it in their own words, the mechanism that functions. But perhaps even more important than whatever happens in the general room where they're having their general discussion is, of course, all the conspiring that goes on behind the closed doors of that walled off enclosure for the 3, 4, or 5 days that people are actually there. And as people who have been following the independent media for the last couple of decades know, when they lock down the Bilderberg conference, they lock down the Bilderberg conference, and nobody's getting near that hotel and whatever's going on inside there, and they will absolutely threaten, harass, cajole, set up people who are attempting to find out what's going on or attempting to interview these people. So I think that should be concerning in and of itself. Clearly, I mean, this is literally conspiracy. They are literally going to conspire with each other behind closed doors in a meeting that was officially denied. People denied its existence for the first few decades of this group's existence. Now that they can't possibly deny it, well, they just go, oh, it's no big deal. We're just talking behind closed doors. What do you care if your elected representatives are talking behind closed doors with financiers and captains of industry and royalty and all these other people? Who cares? Whatever. Go watch some football. Don't worry your pretty little heads about this. Well, I think we should worry about that.
I definitely agree. Whenever they're operating behind closed doors, that definitely shows us that they don't want us to see what they're doing. They're hiding in the dark. They're not in the light having a public meeting with all these people. They want to have it closed doors. So I think that there's some truth to that. Basically, they're not doing the greatest things when they're hiding and trying to keep it away from people. Um, so that brings me to the next chapter, a brief introduction to spontaneous order. How do you define spontaneous order in contrast to planned order, and what examples from recent illustrate its power or failure?
So spontaneous order. When we think of the word order, people think of some centralized order that comes about through some centralized governing authority that sets the rules and enforces the rules. And that could be everything from literal, like the legal system, down to the economic system, down to various institutions that govern our lives in various ways. So if we're going to impose order, there has to be some sort of leader who's giving people marching orders, and those people enforce that out there. But there is a different way of understanding order, and that is spontaneous order. Perhaps we should think of order in the sense of the way that the natural ecosystem, natural world is ordered. There is an order that exists, but it's not because there's some government that's telling the sun to shine and to evaporate the water and to cause the rain cycle, etc. No, that is just how it operates. It's a natural order that naturally occurs. Well, in the same way, human society is mostly composed of spontaneous order. It's not that someone is telling you what to wear today or who to talk to, or who to marry, or those types of decisions that we all know that we make for ourselves. No, it is happening just as the result of our voluntary, spontaneous activity. And we would bristle if somebody was telling us, exactly what to be doing every single moment of our lives. But for some reason, we think for the big things, well, we need someone to come in and step in and tell us what to do. My favorite example, counterexample to that, is language itself. I am speaking English to you not because there is some government that's put a gun to my head and said, if you don't speak English, we're going to throw you in a cage or something like this. And this is the way you speak English. No, I speak English because I'm a human being who wants to communicate with other human beings. And I was raised in an environment where English was the way to do that. So I learned to do that. And now I use my facility with the English tongue in order to talk to people, to persuade people, to communicate with people, to transact with people, to interact with people. And sometimes I make up my own words. And sometimes I say things in ways that aren't grammatically approved. And you know what? Who cares? There's no police that's going to throw me in prison for doing so. It is the spontaneous order of language that has developed over centuries, millennia, however long of human history that has developed to this point where now we're able to facilitate communication and exchange ideas. Wonderful. There was never a government that had to come in and impose that on humanity because we wanted it to happen. And in the same way, if we want security, if we want economic exchange, if we want these types of things, they will occur by the spontaneous voluntary order that comes about through voluntary interaction.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I think where you've been raised and what the culture is and the language is very important. So I think that definitely makes a lot of sense to me. So, who controls the environmental movement? The environmental movement is often portrayed as grassroots, but you suggest a different story. Who is pulling the strings and to what ends?
So when people start to look at the foundation of various important environmental organizations. And I cite, for example, specifically the World Wildlife Federation that everyone knows, and it's the cute panda logo, and everyone has heard of the WWF and its activities over the years. But when you start to look at the foundation of this and who was really literally founding organizations like that, you find, oh, it was a bunch of literal card-carrying eugenicists, including the president of the British Eugenics Society and others who were founding these organizations. And we talked about eugenics earlier and how
Right.
anyone who was everyone who was anyone back in the early 20th century was a eugenicist. So perhaps it's not surprising to find them in the foundation of organizations like this one. But it does raise the question then, why? What exactly is the connection there? And there are a number of answers to that. One of which is the surprising connection. For example, one of the fathers of the national park system in the United States, Madison Grant, is perhaps most famous today for having written The Passing of the Great Race and being a rabid white supremacist who talked about the threat of, these hordes of brown and colored people that are going to threaten the wonderful white race, etc. What is the connection there? Why is somebody who's so concerned about conservation also so concerned about racial mixing and things like that? Well, I think part of it is, again, it goes back to that idea of eugenics, that there is the pristine, the noble, the wonderful stock that must be preserved and fostered, and then there's the icky stock. And if we put that in racial terms, it's going to manifest as racism. If we put it in environmental terms, it's going to be about conserving the noble elk and the deer and the eagle and these majestic animals. And, who cares about whatever rabbits and whatever else? Like they can go sort themselves out. And that's the basis of it. But then secondarily, you have the obvious reality that I think we can all see, that industrial activity of humans has damaged ecosystems around the world, and the strip mining and clear-cut forestry and all of these sorts of things has damaged various ecosystems. And people are naturally concerned about that because we do care about the environment around us, generally speaking. But one way to take that energy and manifest it in a different direction is to essentially co-opt those groups, and to take, for example, the conservation groups, or of course the global warming movement, and putting that on top of that natural concern that people have for the environment and what we're doing, and steering it in a direction. And what direction is that? It always leads to the same equation, which is essentially we need fewer people on the planet. We need to get rid of a lot of the population because it is humans that are killing the earth. We don't have to speculate about that. The Club of Rome wrote about that in one of their publications back in 1991 called The First Global Revolution, in which they literally said in black and white, do not believe me, go read it for yourself. They said that in looking for a problem that we could hang our agenda on, we came up with the idea that it was pollution and global warming and things like this that we could use because that makes humanity the enemy, as in humanity is the enemy of man. And so we will have the solution, which is a big culling of the population, essentially. And that is the dream, and that is what these environmental groups are focused on. So I think we have to understand the environmental movement in terms of that eugenics drive that has been welded on to people's natural concern for the natural world.
Yeah, that definitely rings true. So, it's a little off subject, but you touched on eugenics again and how they wanted to keep like the white race from mixing from other different races. So, I guess if those people are still in charge, why are they allowing so many people from Africa and the Middle East to go to more wider countries like Europe and the United States?
Well, I think we shouldn't necessarily think of this as a monolithic conspiracy in which there is one directive that is being put down. So I think there are a number of conflicting directives. But you will notice that there are essentially still very rabidly eugenics strict policies that are in certain places, like, for example, in Israel, where there is not a vast influx of, foreign populations, etc. In fact, no, it's very strictly controlled. Also here in Japan, very strictly controlled immigration. You will find that there is still that sort of preservation of the purity of the race, or the race slash religio social, whatever you call Judaism. There is still that idea, but then you will find that, for example, Israelis are all for open borders in America. So I think there is a weaponization of immigration that has and can occur, and that I think has to do with the clashing of civilizations, as Samuel Huntington, of course, famously wrote about. That is part of the long-term agenda, a long-term agenda that is being propounded by some elements of the oligarchy, that is about essentially undermining the verities of old. Because if you want to start a new world order, you have to smash the old world order. So I think it's eugenics for us, but not for our enemies, is generally the way I would frame that.
Yeah, that seems to make sense. So, going on to escaping the grand chessboard, drawing on the grand chessboard era of geopolitics, how can smaller states or individuals escape being pawns in the great power strategy?
Once again, and you might see a theme occurring here, but I think once again, people have to stop putting their identity in their nation state or whatever, or their global, nascent global government, etc., as if those are the battle lines, because that is the way we are taught to think of the world. And of course, I mean, going back to whatever, when you're a child and you're playing Risk, and of course, the global map, and you're moving your forces around, and you conquer this nation, and you have that nation state. But I think the real way that power is operating at this point is not based on those nation state lines. It is based on affinities of various billionaire and trillionaire forces in the oligarchy who are conspiring against, in some cases, their own fellow countrymen. Just because, whatever, take your pick. David Rockefeller was an American. Bill Gates is an American. Doesn't mean that I think he has the American population's best interests at heart. And unfortunately, people are hardwired into thinking that it's about this nation state sort of thing. And so they become serviceable and sometimes even willing pawns in this greater game that's going on. That, I'm going to die for the glory of my country, and I'm going to go off to war, and I'm going to, strap on the helmet, and I'm going to do something great for my country. Whereas really, they are, as Henry Kissinger was famously quoted as saying, military men are stupid animals that are valuable pawns to be used on the chessboard. And that is the way that I think the oligarchy sees a lot of these people. So really refusing to be the pawn is the way that we get out of this chess game. No, I'm not going to play your chess game because it has nothing to, it's not for my benefit. It's for your benefit with your big grand strategies of trying to conquer the world. And that's not going to be good for me. And I cite many examples of people who have been betrayed by the would-be grandmasters of this geopolitical chess game.
That's why I like communities like the Amish so much. They're not playing this game with the United States government. They're doing their
Yeah.
own life. They're very peaceful, just living off the land. So I really think that's a good preservation of society there.
Yeah.
Uh, so now, and for something completely different, this essay offers a seemingly lighter contrast. How does humor or absurdity functions as lens for understanding serious systemic issues?
it's a tall philosophical order. All I can say is that myself, I have a lot of different interests and I have different moods and I have different ways of communicating what I'm saying. So I hope people who have followed my work over the decades will know by now I have a humorous side that I let loose from time to time. I also have a serious side and I talk about very serious subjects, but hopefully we can talk about serious subjects in various different ways. And with this essay in particular, I hoped I could inspire something of that wonder and awe that I think has been drained out of us in the modern world, where everyone's cynical and we've all seen everything, and we're consumers that are constantly being sold to in various ways. So now the natural protective stance is to fold your arms and to be cynical about whatever you're seeing because somebody's just trying to sell something to me, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if we stop and think about some of these remarkable, wondrous, strange stories and weird turns in history that come out of nowhere, et cetera, we can be humbled a little bit to understand that this universe really is a remarkable place. And it really is a privilege to be here, being an actor in history, not some sort of spectator to something that's happening to us. No, we are involved in the world and we are here and it is an amazing universe. And if we don't stop to appreciate that from time to time, we're going to lose something fundamental about the human spirit.
I definitely agree with that. So, a letter to the future. You address readers of the future. What legacy do you hope this book leaves, and what warnings do you hope future generations will heed?
As people who read this essay will know, it's a fairly dark essay because it was literally written as a letter to my children and to the world in general and generations yet unborn in the dark depths of the scandemic when populations were being locked down and we were being told that we'll never get out of this until we accept the next genetic slurry to be shoved in our arms, etc. So it's definitely reflective of that moment in time. And unfortunately, as we're recording this, I just wrote an editorial on did the COVID scamsters or can the scamsters stick the landing? As in, what did they get out of that scamdemic psyop that we just lived through? Lockdowns, well, yeah, that's been essentially hardwired into people's mindset now. When in the event of a pandemic, we're going to have to lock down again. The genetic slurry clot shots masquerading as vaccines, well, yeah, they're working on all sorts of mRNA and DNA vaccines for personalized HIV, cancer curing vaccines, etc., and being propounded by Trump and others. Yay, wonderful. Um, and the infrastructure for the biosecurity state, the QR codes and all of these things that were instituted as just temporary emergency measures. You'll have to check in when you go to this spot, or you'll have to present your vaccine passport or whatever it is, has now been wedded in and is becoming part of our daily lives, even though the scamdemic side of it is going away, but we're still now in that technological infrastructure for the biosecurity state. So that's the type of thing I'm warning about in that essay, is that even the concept of human freedom and the fact that governments can't tell you to stay in your own home. And once we start accepting that as a basic premise for social interaction, well, then we're going to have a bad time. And so I'm warning about that. And it's a plea in a certain way to people not to forget that, because if and when we do, then our children and our grandchildren won't even recognize us anymore.
I definitely agree. There's been some stuff coming down the pipe here in the US. I don't know if you heard of Real ID, but that's something they've been doing. And yeah, I definitely think the whole COVID thing was, I never wore a mask the whole time during COVID, but luckily I didn't live in a big urban center where it was more forcibly enforced. So going on to your last chapter, Why I Write, reflecting on your motivations, what compelled you to compile these essays now? And how do you hope this book changes the reader's worldview or behavior?
Well, the book came out this year, but it was certainly not written this year. So, as I talk about in the introduction, in the author's preface, this is the product of 15 years of writing, essentially. So, I've had this in the works for a long time, and I've always been motivated primarily because I have always thought of myself. I always wanted to write a book. I've always wanted to be a writer. So, in a sort of self-serving way, it's about my own progress as a human being. Well, I want to be a writer, so here we go. But also because I think it is probably what I excel at the most is writing and communication in that format. But secondarily, I think it's important to have physical actual physical manifested material in this day and age, because as we know, as we've talked about, the censorship industrial complex is proceeding apace, and it's a lot harder to censor physical media that's been distributed around the world and that people literally have in their hands. So I think that's one manifestation of this. But I don't want to get too self-aggrandizing and oh, I'm so wonderful and this is so important. I mean, as I say in the book, there's selfish reasons for writing as well, and so for people who don't know, George Orwell, aka Eric Arthur Blair, had an essay that he wrote on why I write. So I was essentially cribbing from him and comparing some of what he was writing to some of my own motivations.
And I definitely love how you made a physical book and not just something on the internet because they can just change anything on the internet in 1 second. They can get rid of this video in 1 second. But if you have the book physical copy, you still have it. They're actually getting rid of libraries right now, basically getting rid of the books in the libraries and having computers. My uncle works at a public school and he saw their library was really big, but now they just have a couple books and just computers. So it's more of a computer room rather than a library. So I would like to take the time to share James's book on Amazon. You can buy, is Amazon the best place to buy it, or can they buy it on your website?
I would never exhort people to go to Amazon. If you buy from Amazon, it is there, but I don't like supporting the Bezos beast. The best way to find the book, if you want to find it any other way, is reportagebook.com. If you
Okay.
go to reportagebook.com, you can purchase it. There's a lot of different online sellers, or there's the ISBN number. And from that ISBN number, you can order it from literally any bookstore in the world, should be able to order it for you.
Yeah, definitely order it on that direct website and subscribe to his YouTube channel. He has a lot of really informative videos. I've been a subscriber for years and it's really great. We definitely need to support his work. Go and like every video he has to help the algorithm and just share these videos with your friends because they are really, really important videos and share a lot of really great information. And also check out the CorbettReport.com. And you have an email mailing list too, don't you?
Yes, I do. So I have a Substack. People can find that in the at the bottom of the page there. You can sign up and you can get an email update anytime I post something new.
That's definitely great. Definitely subscribe to his Substack and check out his website as well. And just he's also on all these other Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey. So he's not just on YouTube, so you can follow him on a lot of different sites as well. So I would just like to thank you, James, for providing all this great insight on your book. I really think your book is really real well written, and I think people definitely need to buy and get it.
Thank you. I appreciate all the support.
Yep, and we'll definitely want to have you on again in the future. And I would just like to thank the whole audience for watching. Please share this video with all your friends so we can spread the word. And please subscribe and leave a like on the video. Thanks again for watching. Hope you all have a great day.